Hello Canadians, welcome to All Things Canada, the Canadian show not about hockey. My name is Yusuf Hanna and today we're going to talk about Canada, specifically Quebec. Now a lot of people from Quebec would resent that statement about Quebec being a part of Canada. And if you've noticed in the last few videos about provinces, I've said except Quebec quite a few times. Outside of Ontario and Quebec, or in Quebec and New Brunswick, applies to every province and territory except Quebec. Let's work our way forward in time and see if we can find out why Quebec seems to be the exception to everything. So if you look at Canada, most of it was originally colonized by the French. In 1534, Jacques Cartier planted a cross on the Gaspé Peninsula and claimed it for King Francis of France. From then on, from Newfoundland all the way to parts of Saskatchewan were French colonies. Outside of trading posts, there were major settlements on the St. Lawrence River in Montreal, Quebec City, and Trois-Rivières, as well as on the Atlantic Ocean in Acadia. However, France, being terribly adept at war, found itself completely in debt to England and had to cede most of its territory in North America, with the exception of a few islands in the Caribbean, to the British Empire. By 1763, the major francophone settlements in Quebec were ceded to the British Empire and were added to something called the Province of Quebec. Since then, the Quebecois have found themselves a primarily francophone community being ruled primarily by English people. In 1791, Quebec was renamed Lower Canada. It was called Lower because it was lower in land than Ontario, which was renamed Upper Canada. So between 1837 and 1838, there were major rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada, led in Upper Canada by William Lyon Mackenzie and in Lower Canada by Louis-Joseph Papineau. The only thing these people had in common was a desire to be free from colonial rule, to create their own responsible government. In response, Governor-General Lord Durham drafted an agreement that would merge Upper and Lower Canada into one province of Canada, still united under British rule. The political deadlock that ensued, seeing as English and French Canada had the same number of seats in the legislature, was friendly, to say the least. To give you an idea of how dysfunctional this parliament was, they switched capitals 6 times in 25 years. So there were 4 major parties in this parliament. The Parti Rouge in Quebec, as well as the Clear Grits in Ontario, both had pretty radical ideas, like universal suffrage except for women and First Nations. On the other side of the aisle, there was the Parti Bleu in Quebec, as well as the Liberal Conservative Tories in Ontario, and they advocated something called the removal of seigneurial tenure, which was basically the end of feudalism in Canada. And even when all 4 parties agreed on something, the British Governors-General still ruled with an iron fist, never taking the needs of the people into account. This deadlock pushed the province of Canada into negotiations with the Maritimes to form a union. So, in 1867, during the talks on Confederation, Quebec was vehemently in favor of provincial rights so that they could run themselves the way they wanted to run themselves. Since then, Quebec has been pretty much against a lot of the social issues that English Canada was for. For example, in 1898, a non-binding referendum on prohibition was taken all across Canada. English Canada supported it in huge numbers. Quebec was against it 80-20. And during both World Wars, the English Canadians supported conscription, and Quebec completely denied it. And so it continued like this until 1944, when Maurice Duplessis' Union Nationale took over the Quebec government. What happened was the Union Nationale was a super conservative, super federalist movement that was backed by the Roman Catholic Church. Ideologists who were against this super conservative movement then had to be anti-federalist. So when the Liberals took power in 1959, there was a major Anglophone decline in Quebec as well as a Francophone uprising. Quebec started nationalizing hydroelectric plants, and when Canada mandated something to the provinces, Quebec would vote on it, but it would make it clear that they were voting on it for the good of Quebec, not because it was mandated by Canada. All of these led to the pro-sovereignty movement growing heavily in Quebec. Scene change because I forgot to record something yesterday. There's 3 types of politicians in Quebec. There's federalists, people who support the federal government and its power in Quebec. There's soft nationalists, people who support the devolution of powers to Quebec. And then there's sovereigntists, who seek nothing short of independence for the province of Quebec. Starting in 1963, a group called the Front de Libération du Québec, a militarist and terrorist organization, started fighting for the sovereigntist movement. They started with robberies, and then abductions, and then murders. In October of 1970, the FLQ kidnapped an English diplomat named James Cross, as well as a Quebecois minister named Pierre Laporte. Pierre Laporte would be discovered in the trunk of a car strangled by his own rosary. At the behest of Quebec Premier Robert Bourassa, Pierre Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act. So the War Measures Act basically suspended civil rights and put the army on the streets until peace could be attained and the FLQ could be detained. In all, 62 people were charged for the events of the October crisis, more than half of them without bail. This began the steep decline of the FLQ in the public eye. Because many Quebecois still believed in a sovereigntist movement, including Premier Robert Bourassa, they moved from a militarist and terrorist organization and started becoming more political. They sought to solve the problem of their distinction within the framework of Canada. Fast forward to 1987, Pierre Trudeau was no longer the Prime Minister, in fact retired from politics, and Brian Mulroney was the Prime Minister of Canada. Mulroney wanted Quebec to accept the Constitution, so what he did was he drafted constitutional amendments called the Meech Lake Accord, along with the 10 premiers. Premier Robert Bourassa of Quebec forced Mulroney to include a number of conditions so that Quebec would sign on to the Constitution. Mulroney and the 10 premiers became known as 11 men in suits. They were deciding the fate of Canada behind closed doors, and the fate of a possible distinct Quebec society. Pierre Trudeau eventually came out of retirement to speak against Meech Lake, and what he did was he called Mulroney a weakling for giving in too much to Quebec and said Quebec is no more a distinct society than anywhere else in Canada. Eventually, the Meech Lake Accord lost support in English Canada for giving away too many things to Quebec and lost support in French Canada for not giving enough. After Meech Lake, another movement started to bring the question of Quebec's sovereignty to the people, a national referendum. It was called the Charlottetown Accord, and it was held in 1992. Even though it had wide support from intellectuals and political leaders across the country, the person to oppose it the most was Pierre Trudeau, who again came out of retirement to fight it. He said that the accord was the end of Canadian federal government and that it would result in the disintegration of Canada into its parts. The reform movement in Western Canada also opposed it, and so did the fledgling Parti Québécois, who wanted nothing short of independence. It was defeated 54% to 46% and lost in all of Western Canada and even in Quebec. The anger from the failure of the movement caused many radical separatists to form their own party, the Bloc Québécois federally, as well as the Parti Québécois provincially. The Parti Québécois has since formed governments in Quebec, including the modern one under Pauline Marois. The Bloc Québécois, the federal separatist party, formed the official opposition through most of the 1990s, but have lost considerable support to the NDP, going from 49 to 4 seats in the last election. In 1999, the Parliament of Canada passed the Clarity Act, which set all of the conditions necessary for any province wishing to secede. Quebec currently has its own version of almost everything, and not just in the French name of it. For example, here's a list of federal offices and officers who administer federal programs in all of the provinces except Quebec, and next to them is the Quebecois counterpart. Quebec also has a codified civil law rather than British common law, and this came from the Napoleonic tradition which he established in 1804. Quebec is the largest province of Canada and is the only province in Canada where French is the only official language. New Brunswick is the only province in Canada that has French and English as official languages. Quebec received a token from Prime Minister Stephen Harper when he tabled a motion that said that the House recognized that the Quebecois form a nation within a united Canada. It was passed overwhelmingly, but received considerable opposition from the Liberals, who offered 15 of the 16 votes against it. Pierre Trudeau's son, Justin Trudeau, who is a candidate for the leadership of the Liberal Party today, is vocally against the recognition of Quebec as a nation within Canada. Recently, the newly elected Parti Québécois in Quebec have become kind of a laughingstock in English Canada because they have pretty strict language laws where it's come to the point where they're debating the legality of the use of the term pasta on Italian restaurant menus. Quebec tends to be a lot more progressive than the rest of Canada on most issues, but they're still pretty strong on those language laws. It's all that remains for those sovereigntists in Quebec after they've been struck down again and again by the federal government. In their minds, if Canada didn't look after their obsession with making everything French, they would insist that anything they had control over would be in French. The rest of Canada has signs and labels in both official languages, French and English, but Quebec only has them in French, leading many in English Canada to think that Quebec is basically a nation within Canada anyways. It's come to a point where schools in rural Quebec, where there is a very small Anglophone community, are not allowed to offer education in English, which is slightly unconstitutional, but because minority is not defined in the Constitution, the province of Quebec can mess around with the numbers and make it so that Anglophones in primarily French areas are taught in French. Okay, news segment quickly. Last week the federal government tabled the budget for the coming fiscal year. Not a lot of surprises, skills training and infrastructure investment and things like that. What was funny was that while promising to crack down on tax evasion, they cut the budget for the Canada Revenue Agency, the agency that would crack down on tax evasion. Quebec Liberals elected a new leader in Philippe Couillard, who has an awesome goatee. He, like all of his predecessors, is very federalist, but he does want Quebec to ratify the Canadian Constitution of 1982. Stephen Harper has quietly pulled Canada out of the UN's anti-drug convention, making Canada the first and only country to do so. And there's been a small movement within the conservative caucus of Stephen Harper, especially among pro-lifers, that say Stephen Harper is clamping down on their rights as members of parliament to represent their constituents in their riding. These MPs are exposing a rift that has been in the party since it formed in 2002, with social conservatives in one camp and fiscal conservatives in the other, but not much in between. Also, good news from Ontario. Ontario elementary school teachers have finally lifted the ban on extracurricular activities, bringing everything back to normal. Wheeling back to Quebec, I'm personally a federalist, and I believe that although Quebec is culturally slightly different from the rest of Canada, it still shares many of Canada's core values, and I'd like to see it continue being that way, both for the good of Quebec and for the nation at large. I believe in a strong federal government rather than the devolution of powers, so I oppose the Meech Lake and Charlottetown Accords in principle, though I do want to see some of the reforms from them pass, like a Triple E Senate. Let me know your thoughts, opinions, grievances on the topic of Quebec's status within Canada. Is it just another province, or is it a nation within Canada, or should it form its own nation outside of Canada? And if it does, should it keep Canadian currency and monarchy or not? As always, thank you for watching, and Internet, I'll see you in 2 weeks.